So we are really excited about today's webinar. This webinar is part of the professional development being offered through Carla's Social Justice in Language Education Initiative. We're treating a different topic related to social justice education each semester. Last academic year, you may have attended our webinars and workshops on disability, on centering Asian voices in the language classroom. Today's topic is gender and sexual diversity. In the spring, we'll be doing a workshop on anti-racism and Blackness in the language classroom. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Joshua Paiz, who is a teaching assistant professor at George Washington University and a TESOL teacher educator at Montgomery College and the Community College of Baltimore County. So Joshua is a really busy language educator and language teacher educator. He has published extensively on gender, sexual diversity, LGBTQ plus representation in language teaching. And the title of today's webinar is Addressing Gender and Sexual Diversity in Language Teaching. So welcome, Joshua. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Kate. I'm pleased to be here. And good afternoon to everyone joining from all over the world. This is quite exciting. I'm going to begin today's talk with a pretty common rhetorical move that comes out of queer studies, which is just a positionality statement. It's not designed to at all toot my own proverbial horn, but instead to give you perspective on where I'm coming from as I enter this topic as a scholar and as a human being, right? Also, I hope that it reflects for many of you that we're all coming to this topic from different starting points, right? So I myself was raised in a very far-right evangelical Christian home. Both of my parents were members of the policing community. And so the fact that I find myself doing research related to gender and sexuality, I think is a bit of a surprise for myself, most certainly, and even more so for my family, because discussions about gender and sexuality were taboo, to say the very least, for much of my childhood and formative years. I am myself an applied linguist. I hold a PhD in applied linguistics from Purdue University, and I am a member of full-time faculty at George Washington University, where I work regularly with international students as they acculturate to U.S. higher education, right? And so this sort of meeting point, I guess, or convolution of a very conservative upbringing with a much more liberal training as I pursued a higher education has created this space for my voice that you're going to see here today. Disciplinarily, a lot of what you see today will come primarily from queer theory and critical applied linguistics, as I am myself an English language teacher. A lot of the examples that I reference will tie directly to ESL and EFL education. However, my hope is by bringing in applied linguistics, we can open this up to other language learning contexts. Also a decent bit here from higher education, teaching and learning, and administration. Having given talks like this in a decent number of places over the years, I do want to begin by setting some goals, and we'll use some problematic militaristic language here and some rules for engagement. I would like us all to remember that we are gathered here as professionals united in a shared goal of fostering inclusive learning environments. So because of this, I would ask that we approach today's discussion first and foremost with patience with yourself and with your fellow participants in the conversation, and also understanding, knowing that we're all entering this conversation from different places and different backgrounds and lived experiences, which may influence how we approach today's topic. Finally, I would encourage empathy both with yourself, with your students, and with your peers. And that in today's session, at least, we express this through active listening and thoughtful reflection upon different perspectives in the spirit of collegiality. So just so you know what to expect and when you may be most interested, I'm going to set the stage for today's presentation before we get into the framework that we get from Lavender Applied Linguistics, which is the subfield of applied linguistics most interested in issues of gender and sexuality. From there, we'll move into the pedagogical framework, so some ideas that hopefully you can apply to your own teaching, and then have a brief conversation about some thoughts that we want to keep in mind as we negotiate LGBTQ plus inclusion, especially as in some contexts this may be a slightly more divisive rhetorical and pedagogical move. So when we address this question of why LGBTQ plus inclusive education matters, why gender and sexual diversity matters in educational context, I think we can look to recent history in the United States to see why this matters, right? Um, Up through much of the late 90s, early 2000s, we saw slow progress towards greater inclusion and access to public life for LGBTQ plus individuals. Mid 2000s, early 2010s, this really started picking up steam in the United States and globally. But certainly in the past 3 or 4 years, we've seen a much more aggressive element take hold. Despite this, LGBTQ plus individuals, gender and sexual minorities are still a part of daily life. And when it comes to the students that we're working with, especially if you work with undergraduate students, we have to understand that LGBTQ plus youth, which goes up until about the age of 19, 20, are 120% more likely to experience homelessness at one point or another, and are significantly more likely to struggle with issues of suicide and substance abuse. We also see mental health issues much more prevalent for LGBTQ plus youth than their straight identifying peers. So because of this, we understand that gender, sexuality intersect with student success and what's happening in our classrooms. And if we want to be facilitators of this, we have to understand that we're educating the whole person, and this oftentimes means creating additional space for LGBTQ plus gender and sexual minority students to engage with the classroom. When it comes to the field of applied linguistics, we've actually seen a decent bit of work over the past 15, 20 years when it comes to addressing issues of gender and sexuality in the field from a research and theoretical perspective. In the field of English language teaching, which is my disciplinary home, this really started off in the early 1990s with Cynthia Nelson and some of her colleagues on a panel at TESOL, which was aptly named We're Here, Your Gay and Lesbian Colleagues in English Language Teaching. Since then, we've seen work look at diverse topics, including pedagogy, which is where I focus much of my energy and efforts, materials creation, and representation in teacher education, right? So some of the important points that have come out of this work have first and foremost been an understanding of the nature of identity and second language identity for our students, and how this is performatively constructed through language. And indeed, how the language presented to our students through textbooks and through curricular materials can often reinforce a heteronormative view of the world. And that for many learners, especially English language learners, this view that's presented to them in curricular materials can become a stand-in for cultural norms in the target culture. Additionally, research in Lavender Applied Linguistics has looked at the issue of power dynamics in the class and how heteronormative administrative and classroom structures can impact students' access to the linguistic space and right to exist. Not listed here, but I believe it was Omo Kane was looking at Spanish language classes and was doing some observations, and there was a teacher there who was asking students to describe their boyfriend or girlfriend in Spanish. And a male presenting student, a masculine presenting student, responded with "Mi novio es alto y delgado," my boyfriend is tall and handsome. If you're familiar with the study, you know that the teacher's almost immediate response was to recast that utterance to, "Oh, you mean tu novia es alta y delgada." Despite the Spanish last name, my second language is Mandarin Chinese, not Spanish, so please forgive my pronunciation. But this is an issue because the teacher's immediate response was to take that student's legitimate performance of their sexual identity and recast it as linguistic error. If this occurs often enough, it can, in some classrooms, cast gender and sexual minority students as they attempt to perform their legitimate selves as deficient language learners, right? Delegitimizing certain identity positions. More recent research has shown us indeed that when we're talking about issues of identity in the classroom and their salience for pedagogical interventions, we must consider these issues intersectionally. That is, I myself sitting here, I'm not just a married gay man pushing 40. No, I am instead a mix of my sexual positioning, my gender positioning as a relatively cisgender gay man, but I'm also my lived racial past, which in my case is Mexican American on my dad's side and white Appalachian on my mother's side, right? All of these identity positionings intersect to create and take away voice in different institutional spaces, right? So greater awareness of intersectional forces and how they play out in our classes, and what we as educators can do to create greater space for access and inclusion become much more important. Thinking about how these more theoretical concerns start to impact what we do day to day as language educators, then a lot of early work focused on curricular integration. So how do we bring LGBTQ plus themes and voices into the content of our lessons, whether this is through lived narratives from community members or including where appropriate, including where appropriate literature that includes gender and sexual minorities represented as major parts of their cast and not just one-off side characters. Additionally, there's been work to promote inclusive spaces, whether this be safe and affirming classroom environments for trans and gender nonconforming individuals, or the inclusion of assignments that further trouble normative linguistic practices. This then brings us to something that we as educators can speak to most readily, I feel, and that's this need for critical language awareness. So encouraging students to analyze and challenge linguistic normativity in text and media. Most certainly we can consider what this means from the standpoint of gender and sexuality, but more broadly as critical educators, we can also consider what this means for more dominant varieties of language, whether that be Castilian Spanish versus New World Spanish, or sort of white standard edited academic English versus Indian or Singaporean English in the English language classroom. Now, what I'm going to present to you here comes from a book I published a few years ago called Querying the English Language Classroom, a Practical Guide for Teachers. For the sake of time, I'm just going to give you a very sort of general overview of one pedagogical framework that comes from this larger conversation on Lavender Applied Linguistics. Right. And in this framework, we begin with a couple of pedagogical aims. The first is to raise awareness for LGBTQ plus lives and concerns in the language classroom, because especially in the case of international students studying in the United States in the English language classroom, this may be one of the first educational contexts where these lives have been a larger part of national discourse, right? As we've seen in places like the United States historically, where LGBTQ plus issues in particular and issues of gender equity have been a larger part of national conversations for the past 20 or 30 years. Additionally, a goal of the sort of queered classroom space, or the classroom that's been purposefully designed to address issues of gender and sexual access and inclusion, then, is introducing linguistically situated ways that we index and perform our different identities. Understanding then that if part of our goal is to prepare our students to be communicators and users of the language, part of that is acquiring a sort of second language self. And for some individuals, their gender identity or their sexual identity may be a very important part of that. More so than that, because of the sort of critical focus of these queer inclusive pedagogies, then, is fostering critical thinking for our students and modeling that respectfully for them, as we encourage them to consider what voices we're hearing, what bodies we're seeing reflected in the materials, and more importantly, what's absent. Oftentimes when I give talks like this, educators attempt to take a neutral ground and say, well, if I'm not addressing these things at all, then I'm not politicizing the classroom space. And oftentimes that absence is a reinforcement of the implied norm, which in this case would be a heterosexual and oftentimes a patriarchal view of society. Finally, an aim of this pedagogical approach is to equip students with the linguistic and rhetorical skills needed to advocate for themselves and for others. Because certainly while we can create safe spaces in our classes or in our office hours, eventually those students will leave us. And they need to be equipped, I believe, to be strong advocates for themselves and for their socially significant others after they leave our care as educators. So the first sort of piece of this pedagogical framework is to understand that you should explore with your students, right? A common concern amongst educators when it comes to creating classroom spaces that are more inclusive of gender and sexual minorities is that they don't know enough about the topic, right? They aren't themselves members of those communities, or they're not experts in how to approach these conversations with their students. So I'd say understand that it's okay to explore these topics with your students as a guide in critical discourse, without having to be the expert. This can do a couple of things for your students. This can first and foremost individualize learning for the individual students in your classrooms. It can also help to decenter the classroom, creating a more student-centered approach, right? Another thing that this can then do is it can create space for gender and sexual minority students to participate from a position of expertise, right? To contribute their knowledge to the class in a way that legitimizes those lived experiences further. Also, by exploring with our students, we can oftentimes uncover the locally relevant real-world experiences of gender and sexual minorities and how these are realized linguistically, as opposed to just engaging with them through popular media, which oftentimes has another normative layer on top of it. Beyond this, I would encourage you to find space throughout the curriculum to engage with topics of gender and sexuality, in part because this can avoid those sort of gay day special topics sort of feelings. It can help desensationalize these topics for our students and show that these are indeed part of national discourse, at least here in the United States. And so being a member of these linguistic communities means being able to engage thoughtfully and critically with these national conversations. Additionally, and I think this is less of an issue now, and especially with language educators, but moving away from this sort of debate style approach of inclusion. For example, when I first got started teaching writing way back in 2009, and the marriage debate was heating up in the United States, it was really popular in rhetoric and composition circles, for example, to have students debate marriage equality. This can be really exhausting for students who are members of either a gender minority or a sexual minority, to see their lives and their lived experiences being used as fodder for debate, right? And feeling like they have to constantly justify their existence to their students, right? Additionally, by finding space throughout the curriculum to include gender and sexual minority voices, right, we can create value around these discussions as part of critical literacy and acculturation for our students, and underscore how LGBTQ plus and gender issues are performed and parsed through different linguistic and rhetorical functions. Additionally, I would encourage you to engage in critical reflexive practice yourself as an educator and model this for your student. For me, this is really where the important work of sort of queering the classroom comes in, or creating a classroom that's more inclusive of gender and sexual minorities, because it can make explicit how language, disciplinarity, professional practice, and our assumptions about the world all work together to sort of recreate our perception of reality and our reaction to it. It can then draw attention to how these normative discourses about expertise, about language, and about ways of being, about life, how these all work together to maintain and silence certain ways of knowing, living, and being and doing over others, right? So by engaging in this sort of critical reflexive practice and inviting our students into that work with us, we can ourselves begin to become a little bit more aware of some of our own blind spots. Because when it comes to creating an inclusive classroom space, this isn't a one-off. This is indeed part of what makes this kind of work sometimes so exhausting for those heavily invested in it, is the fact that it's an ongoing process, right? Here we start to get into some of the negotiational aspects we'll talk about later, but tying any content that discusses gender and sexuality in the classroom to disciplinary learning goals becomes important in helping to overcome resistance either institutionally or in the classroom with our students, because this shows that issues of gender and sexuality are an important part of acquiring either disciplinary knowledge or professional sense of self, or even that L2 self that can be facilitative of second language acquisitional processes. It also underscores how engaging with LGBTQ plus themes and conversations, or conversations about gender equity, can be valuable as part of being a modern, informed citizen. Finally, by tying issues or conversations about gender and sexuality to classroom learning goals, this continues that sort of desensationalizing of these topics, the normalizing of engaging in these conversations reflectively and critically. Finally, and this is one where even I myself have started to move a little bit, right? We do want to focus on respectful engagement, keeping in mind that our goal isn't to win over hearts and minds as much as we would love to. Oftentimes, movement on sort of attitudes towards gender and sexuality, they take time to move. When I first came out way back in 2002, I did get kicked out of the house, right? And I didn't talk to my parents for a number of years, and it took my mom, gosh, almost until 2014, 2016 to finally get around to calling my husband and not my friend, right? So these things take time. So certainly we're not here to create radical change, nor do I think we should necessarily hope for radical sort of evangelical change overnight. But we should be creating space to move the needle with our students, right? This may occasionally mean creating space for dissenting voices, but that those voices of dissent must be issued respectfully. And I think this becomes even more important as discussions of gender and sexuality become more charged, especially in the United States in recent history, right? Understanding that there's a fine line between being like, hey, you know what, I was raised in a really conservative home. This is an uncomfortable conversation for me to be engaging in, or this is an uncomfortable sort of body and life to see sort of front loaded because I've been able to ignore it for so long. There's a difference between that and bigotry, right? And bigotry, quite frankly, is the one thing that should always be shut down forcefully and immediately, because it is not coming from a place of respectful engagement. It's not coming from a place of wanting to learn and trying to reconcile competing worldviews. It is instead coming from a place of hate, and there is, quite frankly, no longer any space for that. Additionally, by focusing on respectful engagement, we can showcase the linguistic and rhetorical strategies for respectful disagreement, which, especially in higher education, becomes an important sort of rhetorical tool for students to have, not just in their language classes, but also in their disciplinary classes as well. Now, one of the things that I want to acknowledge at this point as we move into this discussion of negotiating inclusion is, yes, we're all at different places, and there are different levels of negotiation that often have to happen when we're addressing issues of gender and sexual equity and access to instructional spaces. And understand that even though this is the kind of work that I do, it was a journey for me too. I remember when I was working on my master's at the University of Toledo back in 2009, I had a classmate who was really interested in issues of sexuality and language. They were doing their master's thesis, I think it was, on the linguistic practices of drag queens in Southern Texas. And I remember having a sort of visceral reaction to this, thinking, as English language educators, these aren't the topics that we need answers to. We need answers to how can we more effectively teach the future progressive to our students, right? We need answers to how we can help students acquire genre awareness in academic writing. And it really wasn't until I went on and started my PhD at Purdue that I kind of forced myself to sit down and say, okay, well, why did you have such a strong negative reaction to this line of inquiry, right? And I really kind of forced myself to sit down and engage with this body of literature that I had kind of written off for a number of years, right? And it was only through that sort of moment of forcing myself to sit down and to engage with voices that didn't resonate with me disciplinarily, that I kind of found, one, yeah, this is actually a really important topic that we need to be talking about more, but also that I found space for myself to enter into disciplinary conversations, right? So I say this story, or I tell you this story again, because there was a negotiation that I had to have with myself as an educator, as a emerging scholar, before I was ready to have these conversations with others. So understand, if you're coming to today's topic and you feel that little bit of resistance in yourself, there may also be some internal negotiation that has to happen alongside of negotiating these topics with our students and with administrators and with other stakeholders. And that is a legitimate experience to have. So when it comes to sort of negotiating the inclusion of gender and sexual minorities and creating inclusive classroom spaces for us, oftentimes, like I said, that negotiation begins with ourselves. One of the sort of common positionings that we see with this is that of the underprepared educator, right? There is certainly a lot of work that goes into being an effective language educator, a lot of knowledge about language, a lot of knowledge about pedagogy and andragogy, most certainly in classroom management. So learning about issues of race or gender or sexuality, it's one more layer that we have to add on top of this, right? So what I would say is, if you feel like you're that person, really sort of begin by reflecting on your current practices and moments where sexuality, gender, and normativity have become educationally salient, right? So we can return to that example earlier from Kane, right? If we're talking to students about dating, which is sometimes surprisingly common in language classes, right, to talk about lived experience, right? Where are we seeing these moments of normativity pop in? Where might we be delegitimizing certain voices in how we respond? Because as educators, we might be focusing on the wrong thing, right? Additionally, begin to connect with your professional learning networks and your interdisciplinary peers. These can be really powerful spaces. On X, the app formerly known on Twitter as Twitter, there were a number of PLNs that were active that dealt with or that engaged with conversations around gender and sexual equity in language teaching and in English language teaching. Admittedly, a lot of these have understandably moved away from X, but we still see a lot of conversations happening on places like LinkedIn, Blue Sky, and even Slack. I recently joined a community for queer AI researchers on Slack. So they're out there. You might have to look a little bit. Also, I would encourage you, as you continue your own professional development, to make a purposeful effort to include diverse readings on gender and sexuality in your continued professional development. Chris Nicely, for example, is a brilliant individual that does a lot of work on trans and gender non-binary, gender non-conforming issues in French language and linguistics. Also, there's been a lot of work done, interestingly, in medical education and engineering education on different approaches to creating inclusive classroom spaces. And certainly these voices have potential to impact our own practice, even inside of language education. Another thing that we oftentimes hear from language educators who are either on the fence or opposed to the idea of creating classes that are more inclusive of gender and sexual minorities is that this classroom is not the place for it, right? That the personal or the political has no place in the classroom, or, hey, I'm just here to teach Japanese. What does this have to do with gays and lesbians is a statement that we've heard from educators before. And to this, I would point out two things. One, teaching is, when it's in person, is very much an embodied act, and we carry our identity with us, right? You can see my face right now. There's no hiding the fact that I present as pretty stereotypically masculine, right? From the goatee and the bald hair, right? But even something as simple as a wedding ring on the finger is an embodied act of sexuality. It's just one that we've been trained from a very young age to read a certain way, right? So the classroom is already intensely personal. And indeed, as language educators, we often, in higher education at least, form some of the closest connections with students that they'll feel with any member of faculty until they start taking classes, smaller classes in their junior and senior year, right? And education is already always politically and ideologically fraught. We can see this with how loud the parent choice voices or the state's choice voices have gotten, and how voraciously they've attacked K-12 education in the United States in the past 2 or 3 years, right? So if we're going to acknowledge that this is our reality, that the act of education is already politically and ideologically charged, and if we're going to invest in this idea of greater inclusivity, then this is something that we have to lean into. This also then means understanding that taking a stance of neutrality most often serves to, at the very least, tacitly endorse normative discourses, and at the very worst, help to perpetuate the marginalization and silencing of gender and sexual minorities. I was talking to some scholars in India recently who were looking at issues of heteronormativity in language textbooks there. And they're like, hey, we're noticing that our current sort of taxonomy for whether or not a language textbook is inclusive of gender and sexual minorities, right, doesn't work because these textbooks, they're just not engaging with the topic, right? And non-engagement, neutrality, it is a stance, right? And most often it serves to reinforce normative voices, right? Another thing that can be helpful for some educators is understanding that students are already engaging with issues of sexuality and gender in other spaces in their daily lives, right? And they often bring that to the classroom with them already. When it comes to negotiating with our students about why we're including certain content or why we're taking a certain approach, I would first and foremost encourage you to be proactive. One thing that I've taken to doing recently is including respect and professionalism statements in my course syllabus from day one, right? Explaining that this is a place where we're all sort of struggling with and negotiating ideas together. We may hear new things that we fundamentally disagree with, and that's okay, as long as we kind of have that reaction appropriately in a way that doesn't denigrate or silence others, right? Also understand that these sort of negotiations with students over creating a more inclusive classroom space are oftentimes highly contextual and in the moment. They're very emergent. And they may sometimes be a little bit more tacit in nature. They might not be in your face of the, hey, why are you doing this? It may be relatively unnoticed through the form of disengagement in lessons or absence on a day where they know that these sorts of topics will be discussed, or that a certain pedagogical approach will be used, right? Here again, I would say that modeling respectful engagement and disagreement with your students can be a powerful tool. When I was at New York University in Shanghai, the Gay Student Alliance actually invited me and another professor who was herself a member of the lesbian community to come and talk about issues of gender and sexuality in teaching. And her and I were diametrically opposed. I was very much, we need to be having these conversations. We need to create classroom spaces where students can engage and wrestle with these things and challenge their own beliefs. And she was very much, no, this has no place in the kinds of classes that we teach here at NYU Shanghai. But modeling that sort of respectful disagreement for students, I think, was an important sort of moment in their overall education and professional development. Now, we all have to deal with administrators. That is the reality of being a teacher in an institution. So here, learning yourself some admin speak can be potentially helpful, right? So finding ways to tie the work that you're doing to either mission or vision statements for your institution, right, can be ways to quelch some of that administrative resistance we might feel. Likewise, tying our attempts to create more inclusive classroom spaces to the goals, means, and outcomes of our classes, and using that kind of language again can be an important way to connect with that audience, right? And certainly in higher education, we can talk about issues of student retention and success. We can look to some of the changes recently at, what is that, New College down in Florida, where we're seeing an exodus of LGBTQ plus students and faculty from there. So here we can see how institutional culture and orientation to these topics can actively drive away students, right? So tying this sort of queer approach to educational best practices in your specific discipline, whether that's French applied linguistics or Chinese applied linguistics or higher education more broadly, can help overcome some of that resistance. Additionally, tying these approaches to specific learning objectives for your course and for how they help students realize success in your course can also be very helpful. Now, for the sake of time, so that we have plenty of time for Q&A, I'm going to give you a couple of key takeaways, right? First is understanding that there's a rich body of research literature out here that looks not just at English language teaching. I know that that was my primary focus, but that's because of my disciplinary positioning, right? But knowing that there's a rich body of research and scholarship out there to engage with that explores the interplay between language and gender and sexual identity, and it's oftentimes intricate interplay of intersectionality can be quite important, right? Additionally, don't forget that language both constructs and reflects the lived experiences of LGBTQ plus individuals. And as with language, gender and sexual identity and expression is far from monolithic. And the language structures we use to discuss these things are far from monolithic. The way that I index my identity as heavy-set, bald, and furry gay man in the United States in English is very different from how we see that realized in Mandarin Chinese, for example, right? And indeed, what it means to be gay or lesbian or trans in the United States is very different from what it is, from what that experience is in Taiwan or mainland China, right? When it comes to the pedagogical framework, I'd encourage you to remember that an inclusive curriculum integrates issues of gender and sexuality throughout the curricular engagement, whether that's an 8-week intensive course or a 2-semester-long sequence of intermediate 1, intermediate 2, ensuring that representation and visibility and the values that those represent are reflected to students early, often, and throughout, right? The goal of our pedagogical framework here then is to create a safe classroom space for students, enabling learners of all identities to thrive, right? Some of the sort of pushback we hear about inclusive discourses in education is this, well, if we're front loading these other voices or these other identities, that means mine has to be quelched. And perhaps, right? But so much of popular culture, popular media is itself heteronormative and reflects heteronormative worldviews. So creating space for gender and sexual minorities in 1/10 of the curriculum or 1/16 of the curriculum is not going to somehow completely erode straight representation or cisgender representation, most certainly, right? Also remembering then that critical language awareness can empower students to challenge their own biases and assumptions, and to challenge not just heteronormativity or cisnormativity, but even normative views about language, right? You may have noticed a few minutes ago that I used an English construction that is not standard in sort of white middle class edited English. It was very much a more working class construction, and that's because of my roots, right? But if we take a more normative view of what professional English should look like, then that doesn't become an indexing of my working class past. It instead becomes a failure of my ability to speak as a professional, right? So this critical language awareness can empower students to advocate for themselves and to challenge the normative assumptions that they make about language. When it comes to negotiating inclusion, keep in mind that this is a collective responsibility. You're not alone in this. You can connect to other professional organizations, most certainly. And there are also local, either educational or gender and sexual nonprofit organizations that would be happy to partner with you. I'm sure. I think of the Glesson and their Safe Schools initiative for one, right? Also, when it comes to negotiating inclusion, this sort of open dialogue backed by research and disciplinary best practices can help address potential challenges and resistance. And then finally, do bear in mind that self-awareness is important. We often don't realize our own blind spots until we take a moment to reflect. Much of my early work, for example, was almost completely blind to issues, to trans issues or gender nonconforming issues. And it really wasn't until a colleague kind of called me out on it I was like, oh yeah, I do. I need to engage not just with these ideas, but with these voices in the discipline. I need to engage with trans and gender non-binary scholars and that body of literature and theory as well, right? But these oftentimes play vital roles in sort of championing and sustaining this inclusion in our classes and for our students long term. With that being said, I think I have probably talked more than long enough, so I'd love to open the floor to any questions.
Thank you, Joshua. This was really a lovely talk. I really appreciate how you personalized this and talked about your own experience, and also kind of gave us permission to be imperfect in our journey toward being more inclusive of various sexual and gender identities. So thank you for that. There are a lot of questions in the Q&A that are about some of the thorny issues related to adopting this perspective in language classrooms. So I'm just going to pick a couple of them. One is from Maria, and it's about student pushback. Okay. And so Maria is a teacher of Russian, and they wrote, I try to give my students option for gender inclusive language. However, lately I've encountered pushback from students asking me to exclude them from this material due to religious beliefs. I've opted for making the material available but optional, but I feel like I'm betraying the cause. What is the best way to handle this?
Yeah. And this is something where, again, because I came up in a very staunchly conservative background, right? And most of my formative years were spent in a small farming community in the Midwest. I have traditionally taken a much more conservative approach to answering this question. Conservative in the sense of sort of protecting self first, right? So I wouldn't, because not knowing the institutional context or the state or national context that Maria's in is going to shift this response a little bit, right? But I think creating space for those voices, even if it's optionally, if that's the most that can be done in that institutional context, that's better than nothing, right? So I would encourage Maria not to think that you're betraying the cause at all. If you're in this sort of environment where you're facing intense headwinds, either from students or from administration, if the most you can do is be like, here's the required bank of text, here are some of the inclusive texts that I would encourage you to engage with, that may have to be enough, right? And I'm thinking especially of places like Missouri and Louisiana and Texas and Florida right now, where these attempts at inclusion could get you fired, right? The other thing that I would encourage Marie and everybody else to keep in mind is that we may have to be, I don't want to say this, more subtle in how we challenge normativity. We may not be able to get directly to issues of gender and sexuality, but encouraging students to be critical about things like language use and language appropriateness, what kinds of varieties of language we deem more and less acceptable and why, right? Can be an important step to getting them to reflect critically on their own about these other issues as well, right? So first, I want to say, Maria, again, you're not betraying the cause. You may be responding to realities on the ground, right? And it may very well be that in that institutional space, this is the room that's sort of available to you for now, right? So I do want to acknowledge that.
Yeah. So the next question is from Landon, and it's about standard language. And so Landon's question is about they've used an abbreviation, which is the RAE in Spain. I'm assuming that's the version of the Académie Française in Spain, which regulates language. So the question is, how do you navigate colleagues who proclaim that the RAE does not recognize gender-neutral language, and as such, this advancement in linguistics should not be taught in the Spanish classroom? Because without this feature of the evolving language, non-binary students are not able to express themselves in the language as they must adhere to the binary. I've heard this a lot from Spanish teachers, so
yeah,
this is a really important question.
Yeah, so here first, I would say, because most of the people that I know that do Spanish linguistics and gender and sexuality, a lot of them focus on heritage language learners, right? In the US. So I haven't heard that much about this particular sort of normative institution, right? So here I would say turning to work in related languages, I'm going to go back to Chris Nicely and French Applied Linguistics, because there you do have the Académie Française, which is very sort of ham-fisted in their sort of normative approach to the French language. And Chris Nicely has done a decent bit of work trying to connect, to overcome the sort of resistance that we see from colleagues who might be like, but we have this sort of standardized body and I have to prepare my students for this because they may go and take a language assessment later, right? And that language assessment may be important for career functions or immigration functions, what have you, right? So if this normative body is creating the standard, I have to prepare my students for that standard, right? Chris has done a lot of good work preparing educators to navigate that sort of gap, right? In English language teaching, especially in English for academic purposes, there's often pushback towards this idea of including voices from non-Anglophone varieties of English, like Indian English, Singaporean English, or China English, right? And to this, I respond that language always evolves. If it didn't, English wouldn't sound the way that it does today, right? I would still sound like, hey, class, man, have been twain sooner. But I don't. And I also don't sound like Chaucer, one that I wrote the Sota. No, I sound like this because language changes and evolves. And it's still changing and evolving even with these normative bodies. So if we're going to accept that language changes and evolves, and that our students are going to exist in a linguistic space that we're not aware of yet, or that we may not ourselves inhabit, then of course this means that I should create space for these alternative voices, right? Because language is not monolithic, attempts at standardization aside, right? That being said, you will always have those colleagues who are like, you know, in the case of English, I learned on Strunk and White, and that is like God's holy word on the English language. And if it's anything else, it's bad language and bad students and bad learners. But I would say another thing that we can do then when we're engaging with our colleagues, if they see themselves as educators, right, is asking them to think about, well, how does this color how they see students and decide who is good student, who is bad student, right? And how they're going to sort of focus those instructional efforts, right? If that makes sense.
So we'll do one more quick question, and hopefully this is a quick one. So this is a question about students' age. So when is it appropriate to start introducing topics of gender and sexuality in the language classroom? What age of learners would that be appropriate to start having those conversations?
Yeah, and I understand where this question is coming from, because especially if we look at like the history of especially the gay male movement, and gay male sexuality in the United States over time, it has been heavily sexualized even inside of that community, right? So I can certainly understand where that's coming from. I will say that there is this need to not conflate sexuality with sex acts, right? Most certainly. However, when it comes to something like creating a more gender inclusive classroom space, this can start really young by even thinking about, well, what materials am I showing when I'm talking about jobs, right? So when I'm showing pictures of police officers and firefighters, are they all male? Because if they are, which is what Google might pop up on Google when you do a quick image search, this is a place where we can sort of engage in that sort of problematizing by purposefully including images of female firefighters, right? So being purposeful in the materials that we're presenting, right? Or the images that we're presenting, instead of engaging with it head on and having in-depth conversations like we might have in the university classroom, including this representation at a more sort of background sort of level through the images that we use to support the curriculum materials.
Great, thank you. So
Happy
we've
to.
gone a little bit over time, so I know we can't get to everybody's questions today, but thank you so much for your participation and for attending. I want to thank Joshua for this really thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation. You're getting all kinds of positive feedback in the chat right now. A Carla staff member has just put in the chat also information about our next social justice webinar, and also about where you can find the recording of this webinar. It should be up on our website within a couple of days. We're going to work quickly behind the scenes to get Joshua's work available to you. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Joshua. Have a great day.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and we hope to see you soon in another Carla presentation.
For sure. Take care, all.